There's been a growing trend in the Minecraft community over the years, one that promotes building larger scale builds over the more modest sized ones of the past. The bar for what makes an impressive build has been raised, at least online. Builds usually have to be huge and complex nowadays in order to get the attention. Popular YouTubers whose content focuses more on building are encouraged to build bigger than ever before, since that's what the audience wants to see. Gone are the days of simple starter house building videos that anyone could build. They've been replaced by overly sized builds that would take any non-professional YouTuber months or even years to complete. Audiences love to see insane projects that push the game to its absolute limits. But lately, there's been a sentiment that some players prefer the builds of the old, both in scale and simplicity. Whenever you watch one of these large build videos, it can feel very separate from the actual experience of playing the game. You might feel disappointed that your builds aren't as large as the ones in the videos that you watch, and therefore unimpressive. I want to use today's Minecraft discussion video to talk about how there's value in creating small builds. Value that you may not have realized. And just because these types of builds don't really gain online traction like they used to, it doesn't mean that you should be discouraged from building on a smaller scale. It's easy to get misled into thinking that builds only have value if they're large, but that's not true. Building small is more accessible to players with less time to spend on the game. Smaller builds generally take less time to create than larger ones, but that doesn't mean that they're less impressive. Sure, they miss out on the scale factor to impress players, but they can still incorporate much detail and thought into the designs. Part of the fun in making smaller builds is that it's easier to add storytelling details in the build without getting lost in the rest of the build. In my ice cream shop build in my Forever world, I added armor stands with various trimmed helmets as ice cream flavors inside. This kind of detail usually gets lost in big builds that are meant to be seen from far away. And by building on a smaller scale, you get to incorporate more details in your builds that will be appreciated, as you'll only really see them up close. On a smaller scale, it forces you to get more creative with how you use the blocks and decorations in the game in unique ways. On a larger build, you can get away with using full blocks to add detail, since the scale is much greater. This is why I believe that building on a smaller scale isn't necessarily easier than building on a massive scale. If you want to make a sign on a larger scale, you'll probably build each letter using blocks and maybe stairs. But on a much smaller scale, then banners or banners in shelves are usually the preferred option since the scale is smaller. Building techniques used in each case are completely different depending on the scale, but one isn't exactly easier than the other, and one isn't better than the other either. What can be said about building on a smaller scale, though, is that while it's still a challenge, the time it takes to create a small build is often much less due to placing less blocks. For those of us that don't have much time to play the game, building on a smaller scale allows you to start and finish a build project over a shorter period of time. Larger builds can sometimes take weeks or even months to build, and over that time you might get inspired to build something else. This leaves you with a bit of a predicament in that you can either start a new build project, leaving your current one unfinished, or you can ignore this and push through to make progress on your large-scale build. While I wouldn't say that either are ideal, as one, you end up with unfinished builds if you do this too often, and the other can easily lower your enjoyment in the game if you keep passing up on the opportunity to build new things that you're inspired to build. There's a tricky balance to be had when creating large projects that you don't really have to deal with when you build on a smaller scale. Builds can take an afternoon to create, and then you're finished, ready to move on to the next project. There is a tricky balance to be had when building large builds that you don't really have to deal with when you build on a smaller scale. I think both playstyles can work, but it's definitely a lot easier to enjoy the game when you consistently start and finish builds, and you can build them whenever you're inspired to. Since smaller builds can be made in a shorter time frame, they can be created more reliably. If you do want to build larger projects though, a trick that I use is to have an ongoing large-scale project in the background that you can return to after finishing some other small-scale projects. I like this process because it means that you can still work on larger builds when you've recently finished a small build but haven't gotten inspired to build something else yet. You can grind away at a section of the large build. Personally, I'm okay with having 1 or 2 unfinished work-in-progress builds that I can return to after finishing one of my smaller builds. And currently for me, that large-scale project is my end palace that I've been chipping away at for the last month or so. Besides the start of the building process, the rest is just building chunks of the build when I still want to play the game, but I haven't gotten inspired to build a new thing yet. If you asked me what some of my favorite builds I've made in my Forever World are, you might expect me to say something huge like my volcano or my cathedral. In reality though, while I've enjoyed building those builds, they're definitely much more of a commitment, both in planning and time required to create them. Some of my favorite builds are the smaller ones, the ones that bring my world to life, the ones that can be made in as little as an afternoon. These small builds are refreshing to build, especially after working on some truly massive projects. They're not the flashiest builds, and they probably won't get many clicks if you were to upload them online, but I think there is real value in making small builds. Not everything needs to be big. A factory being large makes sense, but if you build everything big, then you're not really playing with scale, you're just making more work for yourself. A large build looks large because they're surrounded by smaller things. When everything is huge, it becomes harder to appreciate the size of a particular build. So, I would encourage you all to fill your world with smaller builds in between the spaces of your larger projects. They'll add up and become more impressive collectively once you've built enough of them. I don't have anything against people that build large-scale builds. In fact, personally, I make plenty of larger builds myself, but I do think that the community's focus on building big is detrimental to the player base's enjoyment of the game. Smaller scale builds feel more personal because, well, anyone can build a small build. It doesn't mean that anyone can build a good-looking small build, but it does mean that it can be tackled in an afternoon or an evening, and I think that's special when you get inspired to create and you just do it. In a sense, when you build in such a small time frame, you're capturing your feelings and thoughts in that moment that you had at the time when you made that build. This wasn't a build that took months of planning and creating and block gathering. It was one that you built on a whim and decided to create in a corner of your world. I am curious if the building trends of building large will continue, or if building on a smaller scale will become the new popular thing. If people will get tired of seeing only large-scale mega projects. But what do you guys think? Do you think that building small will return to being fashionable? Or do you think that the current trend of building large-scale builds is here to stay? I think what's cool about social media and online Minecraft spaces is that you get to see both ends of the spectrum. There are communities like r/detailcraft on Reddit that tackle the subject of building very small details for your builds, and I think it's cool to see. I don't know if this sort of thing will ever become more mainstream in popularity, and you do of course see specific videos online that circulate promoting a smaller build, but I think that it is easy to see that the more popular builds are the ones that are these mega projects which take dozens of hours to create. I do think though that the balance of large and small builds will shift to be more equal in the future as more people realize that seeing smaller scale builds feels more personal and relatable to the average Minecraft experience. But with all that said, I would like to thank you all very much for listening to today's Minecraft discussion. If you enjoyed the video, I'd encourage you to like and subscribe, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one.